This is my text for the day. There is pleasure in recognizing old things from a new perspective. Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, famous bongo drum player, the father of quantum electrodynamics, but I'm sure you all knew that. So why did I choose this as my text? Well, because I'm hoping to get a new angle of vision on a familiar topic to me, the 46th North Midland Division. Now, I've often felt, and I've said this to David more than once, the sovereign virtue of any historian is curiosity. Because if you're not curious to ask the question, you'll never get an answer. I think I have curiosity, but it's a bit random. I can't kind of direct it. I'm not like my granddaughter, the ineffable Bronwyn, my elder granddaughter, who sometimes goes through what her father calls a why period. So everything she just says why. Well, that's not much use either. You never get anywhere if you ask why for absolutely everything. But occasionally, my curiosity will cut in the most strange ways when I'm not expecting it. Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, I was putting the cutlery away after doing the washing up. I looked into the cutlery drawer and I thought, why have we got so many teaspoons? We got hundreds of them. There's piles of them. Then I thought, do you ever remember buying a teaspoon? No. Do you ever remember buying any cutlery? Except maybe a knife? No. Who bought all these teaspoons? When did they buy them? I haven't come up with the answer yet. I daren't ask my wife. She'd probably think I'm losing the plot. She usually does. But my curiosity kicked in a while ago about the 46th North Midland Division. Now, I'd grown up with the 46th North Midland Division since I first discovered it when I was about 14, and it's obviously from my part of the world. So I'd had, virtually 60 years to be curious about an aspect of the 46th North Midland Division. And what I was curious about was North Midlands? The only person I have ever met who said that he was, quote, from the North Midlands, though he actually wasn't, what he meant was that his family originated there, was the late Richard Holmes, who said to me once, I'm really a chap of the North Midlands. I don't think of myself as a North Midlander. I never met anyone else who thinks of himself as a North Midlander. And as for the 46th Division's sister formation, the 48th South Midland Division, I don't know anybody who's ever said to me, I'm from the South Midlands. It's a strange concept once I began to think about it. Now, if you look at the other territorial divisions, they belong to real places. Northumbria, East Anglia, West Lancashire, the Highlands, the Lowlands, the two London divisions. And then you get a North Midland division and a South Midland division. And practically everyone who ever writes about or thinks about the Midlands divides it east and west. The BBC, political scientists, demographers, economic historians, everyone divides it east and west, not north and south. Now, if we look at the composition of this division, it's units from Staffordshire, from Derbyshire, from Nottinghamshire, from Leicestershire, and from Lincolnshire. Now, this strikes me as being a bit of a shotgun marriage because, to me, Leicester, place I lived for 6 years, Leicestershire is definitely East Midlands. Nottinghamshire is in East Midlands, but if you go north, I suppose it's North Midlands. I suppose you could say Derbyshire qualifies as North Midlands because, I mean, Chesterfield's practically in Yorkshire, isn't it, Andy? So, and Staffordshire, well, Staffordshire's a funny county. It's, you know, you've got the potteries in the north, and you've got hunting, shooting, fishing, Staffordshire in the middle, and you've got the Black Country in the south. I never thought of myself ever as a Staffordshire person until I went to Birmingham University when I had a colleague, a waggish colleague called Richard Robinson, who always used to introduce me to people. This is my new colleague, John Bourne. He is a Staffordshire person. I always thought of myself as a potteries person, not as a Staffordshire person, because the potteries, at least when I was growing up there, was the most peculiar and, you know, unique place. I didn't really think of myself as Staffordshire. It's not as though we got, you know, a major county cricket club like some counties I could mention, you know, that helped forge that identity. So I remember saying to a friend of mine, nobody divides the Midlands north and south. A chap called Steve Cullen, who supports Kidderminster Harriers and Manchester United. Kidderminster did rather better last season than Manchester United. And Steve said, well, actually, there is another kind of area of British life that does divide the Midlands north and south, and that's football. I mean, looking around this audience, many of you will remember the old 3rd Division North and 3rd Division South, but in the minor leagues as well, further down the pyramid, they often get divided north and south. Now, one of the sort of clues for me in sort of social history of Britain, or England anyway, is the Football League. This is the Football League when it was constituted in 1889. You will notice, that those of you football fans, that this is the order in which they finished. Oh dear, Stoke seem to have finished bottom. How very sad. That doesn't really give you any clues. I mean, Wolverhampton, West Brom, Derby, Notts County and Stoke are all North Midland Division teams. And then I had a brainwave. I get them about once every 15 years. I thought I'd look at Division 2 when it was first formed. I'd never done this until this moment. I know that off by heart. I once asked a group of Birmingham University students to name me the teams that formed the original Football League, and one of them said Brighton. Yes, we all laughed, sir, quite right. Not Brighton, no. So I looked at the formation of the 2nd Division. Now, I'd never looked at this before. I had no idea that Crewe Alexandra were founder members of the 2nd Division. But look at that. I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams that are North Midland. But the 2 that stand out there for me are Grimsby Town and Lincoln City. So maybe there is some kind of cultural link, because Lincolnshire is a very strange place. It's not the East Midlands. Is it the North? I mean, some parts of it are farther north than parts of Yorkshire, but is it northern? It's an odd place. It's difficult to put it into any kind of category. But there they are. 2 of the founder members of Division 2 were North Midland Division teams. And the only thing I could think that might link them, you know, other than them being shotgun married, was the Trent Valley. So it's the Trent Valley division in some respects. Right. This is a very important book in my life and in my development as a historian of First World War. I was born in 1949 and I grew up surrounded throughout my childhood by memories of war. But the war memories I was surrounded by were of the Second World War, not the First. By the time I was 10 years old, I could have given you a pretty good, accurate narrative account of the First World War, of the Second World War. I didn't need to read anything about it. I don't actually remember reading anything about it, apart from sort of novels like Reach for the Sky, and that kind of, and being brought up on all those classic post-war British war films, Cockleshell Heroes, Dunkirk, The Man Who Never Was, Reach for the Sky, Dam Busters, and so on. And this reinforced it without me having to do any reading about it. The first war I did actually do any reading on was the American Civil War. Because my father was a great Westerns fan, his ideal film usually starred Errol Flynn and began with a fight in a saloon where Gwyn Big Boy Williams would throw somebody through a plate glass window into a horse trough. This was my dad's ideal film. And if this didn't happen in the first 4 minutes, he'd turn to me and he'd say, "Bit slow this, our kid." So I was always interested in Westerns, and through Westerns, many of which have a Civil War motif, they died with their boots on in films like that, I got interested in the American Civil War. And in my grammar school library, we had the volume which was extracted from Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which covered the American Civil War. It's the one with a photograph of George Armstrong Custer on the front, with a chap he was at West Point with, who'd fought for the Confederacy. And this is a wonderful book, and it's got lots of great pictures in it, taken by Matthew Brady and others of the American Civil War. So I read about the American Civil War, but I'd never really read about the First World War. The First World War only existed, in my understanding, through my grandfather, my mother's father, Jesse Sheldon, who died in 1918, 10 days after he was discharged from the army. And he never served on the Western Front. So I thought, well, anybody who didn't serve on the Western Front, it's not very interesting, because I'd heard of the Western Front, obviously, everybody had. But he was at Gallipoli in Mesopotamia, 7th North Staffords. But he was interesting to me because he wasn't so much as a presence in my life as an absence. There were no photographs of him. I had to make special application through my mother to get his medals replaced, Pipsqueak and Wilfred. But I hadn't got anyone really, when I was very young, to talk to me about the First World War at all. I started to get interested in it when, quite at random, I took John Terrain's Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier, off the shelf sometime in 1963. It was before the series on the Great War, which he and Corelli Barnett wrote, which came out in 1964, originally on BBC Two, but then they started showing it on BBC One before it had finished on BBC Two. Many of you must have seen it. When I had my inaugural class for the MA, British First World War Studies at the University of Birmingham, I would ask people what first got them interested in the First World War. And it was either family history, or because their imagination was captured by the BBC Great War series of 1964, or by the later series, the one about Vera Brittain, Testament of Youth, with Cheryl Campbell as Vera Brittain. A rather more attractive Vera Brittain, in my view, than the real Vera Brittain. But there it was. Those were the three main reasons why people had got interested in the First World War. Now, when I picked this book up, which would have been sometime in 1963-64, I'd never heard of the 46th North Midland Division. I'd got no concept of the First World War having what you might call a local history and identity. To me, it was all about, Prussia and Russia and Austria-Hungary and Turkey. It was international, global. It wasn't local. Now, this was very uncurious of me because I grew up surrounded by war memorials of the First World War, but I didn't start taking any interest in them until I started reading about the First World War. Now, this is an important book for me. and it's one which keeps echoing in my life. It was written by Sir Raymond Priestley, who was later Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Birmingham. He was a geographer and geologist who had been to Antarctica with Ernest Shackleton. And one of my colleagues when I arrived in Birmingham was Richard Shackleton, who was Ernest Shackleton's grandson and looked just like him. And like Ernest, died young. But it also showed me how local the war was, because at the end of this book, there's a very detailed order of battle. And I noticed that the machine gun officer, the 46th North Midland Division, was Sir George Wade. Or my Auntie Maud worked for Sir George Wade on his pottery factory. And in those days, where people were less concerned about whether you had a high-vis jacket on and a hard hat, small children could be taken walking around pottery factories to, take their aunt some sandwiches for her lunch or whatever. And I remember being patted on the head by Sir George Wade. Lovely old boy, patted me on the head, and he said, "What a simply splendid child," which showed he was a man of judgment and discrimination. So I thought, gosh, Sir George Wade was the first person I ever met who I knew I'd got a gallantry medal from the First World War. When I got interested in it, I discovered I was actually surrounded by them. But Sir George Wade. Because the First World War didn't have any heroes. The Second World War had lots of heroes. The First World War didn't seem to have any heroes. If you'd asked me when I was 15 or 14 to name a hero for the First World War, I wouldn't have had a clue. If you'd said Second World War, I said Douglas Bader, Philip Vian, Leonard Cheshire, Guy Gibson, whoever, but not the First World War. And suddenly realised for the first time that actually this war had heroes, because there is a theme I picked up very early in my reading about the First World War, which is that the role of British soldiers in the First World War is simply to suffer and to die. They don't actually do anything. Things are done to them. They do not do, they are done. And then I realised with these heroes that this cannot be true, because these heroes have agency. They do things. Even today, there is a certain theme in British historical writing on the First World War, where whatever else British soldiers do, they don't kill anybody. Well, that's what they were there for. As my old tutor, John McManus, who was the adjutant of the 1st Northumberland Fusiliers in the Western Desert, said to me once, "War isn't about dying, we all die. It's about killing," which for 2 generations of mainly British men, they had to, as it were, be turned into killers. In a way in which those wars had not taken place, they would not come close to the possibility of ever killing anyone. In a very civilianized, law-abiding society, that you have an entire generation which is told to go out there and kill. And do. Though most of them, in my experience, were reluctant to talk about those aspects of war, though not all of them. So, here's a hero, Sergeant William Harold Coltman, VC, DCM and Bar, MM and Bar, from Burton-on-Trent. Great man Coltman, a devout Christian, no idea why he joined the army in the first place, really, because he went up to his commanding officer, this is the 1st 6th Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment, and said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm a Christian, I do not believe in taking human life," which sort of begged the question why he joined the army in the first place for me. Now, in the sort of BBC version of the First World War, his commanding officer said, "Sir, you're a coward, we'll take you away and shoot you." But he didn't. He said, "Oh, very well, Coltman." He said, "You can be a stretcher bearer." And the same commanding officer, when he died, in 1955, I think it was, left Coltman £25 in his will. That's what he thought of Coltman. Here's another photograph of Coltman. This is my favourite photograph of Coltman. It was given to me by my uncle Jeff Whitehouse, who wrote a book on the great camps on Cannock Chase. It's one of the great military encampments of the First World War in South Staffordshire. And he just gave it to me. He said, "Do you know who that is?" I said, "It's Bill Coltman." He said, "I thought you'd know, and I thought you'd be interested." He said, "Would you like to have it?" So he gave me the photograph. This is sort of a cropped version. And he said, "I'm sorry about the quality of it." He said, "But I'm sure you know," which I didn't, "that when serving British Army officers in uniform meet a winner of the Victoria Cross, they are obliged to salute." I said, "No, I didn't know that, Jeff." He said, "Well, there I was. I just got Mr. Coltman to stand still and right in the camera, and this bugger comes up and goes and jiggle the camera." So you not only have a great man, Coltman, you have a moment caught in time of respect from later generations of British Army officers for heroes of the First World War. Here's another hero. This is Humphrey Charlton, sometimes known as the man who won the war. He was the man who led the attack on the Rickerval Bridge at Bellinglees on the 29th of September 1918. He didn't exactly rush to join the army. He didn't join up until 1915. He joined up in the Veterinary Corps. As you can see, he's fond of horses. He emigrated to Canada. That was taken in Canada. We don't dress like that normally in North Staffordshire. And he was in the ranks for a long time before he's commissioned. No one has ever heard of him until the attack on the Rickerval Bridge, for which he gets the DSO. And he later, in the fighting post the crossing of the St Quentin Canal, gets the MC. So I thought, wow. He was the son of a clergyman, classic background for pre-war British Army officers. But then nothing happened. I seem to be the only person in the entire world who was interested in the 46th North Midland Division until towards the end of the last century. God, it makes you feel old saying that, doesn't it, the last century. Started with this book by Christopher Moore, which focuses on his grandfather, Private Walter Butterworth, 1st 5th Leicesters. And this is a book which very much sets its face against what you might call the traditional view of the First World War. Terrible it was, rats as big as footballs, shot our officers we did. Everybody was fed up by 1918, sitting in frontline trenches reading Wilfred Owen. Well, it wasn't like that, and this comes over strongly in this book. And this is a man who's not really a historian, he's more of a fiction writer, novelist, who thought, wow, this was an amazing achievement which I've never heard of, and my grandfather was part of it. This is really rather special. And then we started getting memoirs. Tommy Higgins, 1st 5th North Staffords, the Potteries Battalion of the Territorials, published in 2005. He was in 11 Platoon C Company, captured at Lens on the 1st of July 1917, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war working in German salt mines, where he was treated, as many British prisoners of war were, very badly. He became policeman after the war and rather turned against the idea of the war being a triumph. I think when he wrote his memoir, which he didn't write in 2005, that was when it was published, it was in that period of alienation, on mass unemployment, no homes fit for heroes, and so on. And then we got this book by Alan MacDonald, which is the companion to the book he did on the 56th London Division, which his grandfather served in. 56th London Division, 46th North Midland Division took part in the diversionary attack at Gommecourt on the 1st of July 1916. An utterly pointless attack. The late Earl of Harrowby, the 6th Earl of Harrowby, who I knew very well, and he was a veteran of the First World War and served in the North Midland Division Royal Field Artillery, he said to me, and Lord Harrowby was a Christian gentleman, not given to strong language, he said to me, it couldn't have been more bally obvious that we were going to attack if we'd stood on the parapet and shouting, "Coming over tomorrow, Fritz!" Well, that was the point of it, really. You know, you got to draw German troops in. But once those troops were drawn in, it was absolutely pointless making the attack. And of course, the 46th North Midland Division was the absolute left flank of the attack on the 1st of July 1916 and was enfiladed by the entire German army to the north. And this was the second disaster it had suffered after the terrible hammering it got the Hohenzollern redoubt, the worst day of the First World War in Staffordshire on the 13th of October 1915. And then we started to get more modern studies. Simon People's fairly recent account based on his earlier Birmingham University PhD thesis. And this has led some people to make outrageous claims for the 46th North Midland Division, indeed for the 137th Staffordshire Brigade. I'm often called upon, I was recently, to give this lecture in Staffordshire. It tends to go down quite well. I refused to do it again because I've done it so many times. I said, I'm not doing this again. Tongue in cheek. But when the Staffordshire Brigade crossed the St Quentin Canal at Bellinglees on the 29th of September 1918, Marshal Foch, no less, described it as the blow from which there could be no German recovery, nor was there. Now, you'll all be familiar, I'm sure, in a distinguished Western Front Association audience, that things did change over time in the First World War. I was brought up on A.J.P. Taylor. All clever grammar school boys like me loved A.J.P. Taylor because he was what would now be called cool. And he used to give these lectures on the telly where he never moved. He just stood there like that with his little dicky bow on, and he would talk about whatever. And, you know, held people enraptured. So it's not just Johnny Cash. There's a reason I don't move. It's got to do with A.J.P. Taylor as well. And of course, until recently when I was compelled, you know, for obvious reasons to use PowerPoint, I never used to use pictures at all because AJP stands for all jaw and no pictures. So we used to talk. And, but of course he had a very unreconstructed view of the First World War and the British Army's role in it, including the immortal statement that the British Army didn't learn anything in the First World War except how to repeat its mistakes on an ever larger scale. Now, once I started to get into the First World War, I realised this was ridiculous. And especially once I got into archival study, when you could see you've got a group of dedicated, hard-working men who were trying to analyse what went wrong and put it right and find the most effective way of working in the future. And it's constant, absolutely constant. Not at all, well, we did it like that, but we'll do it again and we do it bigger. It's absolutely nonsense. The British Army at the end of the First World War is nothing like the British Army of 1914, 15 or 16. It's a completely different animal. Now we'll be aware of the ways in which the army evolved. Its weaponry evolved, its tactics evolved, its structure evolved, particularly the devolution down to platoon level after the famous instruction SS-143, which made the platoon the basis of infantry tactics. But there's one area I think, where people are not so aware that the army evolved. And that's at the personal level, or the level of personnel. Because quite often, if you see portrayals, say, of British officers in 1918, they seem to be identical to British officers in 1914, i.e. young, innocent, public school with a moustache. And people, I find even in quite widely read audiences, people are not aware of the extent to which you might call the sociology of the officer corps changed. Now, this is close to my interests at the moment. At the WFA President's Conference a few weeks ago, somebody asked the panel at the end, I was on the panel at the end, what sources they used. To which my answer was, it depends what I'm investigating at any particular moment. But there are two sources which I think are underused by historians of the First World War, and which I've become rather fond of. The first is officers' service files. Now, I think these are widely used, but they're widely used mainly, I think, for family history. So if your great uncle Fred was a subaltern in the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, you might get his file, but that's it. And of course, the thing about these files is they have survived in far greater numbers than the other ranks files, which are so problematic. I mean, my friend Geoffrey Noon, when he was doing his MA thesis at the dissertation at the University of Birmingham on his father's Royal Field Artillery battery, he found 2 surviving service files out of 1,000 men. So they give you the general figure, they say, well, perhaps 60% of the files were destroyed in the notorious German air raid of 7th, 8th of September 1940. But it's the way the bombs landed and the way the London Fire Brigade put the fire out was random, and it could destroy entire areas, where there are no files that survived at all. But officers' files have survived in far greater numbers, and most of them are available provided the chap left the army by the 31st of March 1922. And I've got really interested in these. Now, some of them are, to put it mildly, disappointing. When I was working on an article with my friend Tom Shippey on Tolkien, I thought I'll get Tolkien's service file. If you go down to the public record, hush my mouth, the National Archives, to look at his Tolkien service file, you're not allowed to look at it on your own. Somebody has to sit with you while you do it, unless you steal it or annotate it or, look for hobbits in it or whatever. And so I just ordered it. Send me a photocopy. 110 quid. God, I'd have a lie down in a darkened room when they told me how much it would be. But it came, and I read it. And it's just totally and absolutely boring. It's dead boring, as my granddaughter Bronwyn would say. It's dead boring. Apart from the first couple of pages, which was the standard army form saying, age, where were you educated, who recommended you for this commission, do you have a preference, which regiment / battalion you would like to join. All the rest of it was medical boards. When Tolkien was invalided out with trench fever, he went through a series of boards for the rest of the war, and they were all the same. They'd say, well, Lieutenant Tolkien is a bit better than he was, but he's still not well enough. Send him to Sunderland. Yes, I seem to like sending people up to the northeast to recuperate. And then he'd have another board, and they say, well, yes, there is some improvement, but he's still blah, blah, and he's not ready. So he spent the rest of the war shuffled around various medical boards. So not frightfully interesting. But others can be absolutely fascinating, and you never know until you've read them. that's the first thing I'm keen on as a way into the First World War, officer service files. The other one is genealogy, because again, most people use genealogy, as you'd expect, for family history. That's what they do. They try and construct their family tree, as I've done myself, but you can use it in other ways. You can identify people. It's amazing how many people are out there in family trees. We're not talking about famous people, we're talking about Mr. Average second lieutenant of the First World War. There'll be some information. Now, you have to be careful with it, because some people who do family history are frankly stupid. It's also sometimes difficult to use because all the indexing is done on the transcripts. And the transcripts are done by people who are even more stupid. And the number of times I've read on the index that somebody got married in Hanover, Jamaica, you think, it turns out to be St George's, Hanover Square, the favoured church of the posh classes, for matrimony. So you have to be careful with it. But there is an immense amount of stuff out there. And one of the things I'm interested in about officers of the First World War, those who survived, is what happened to them after the war. Were their lives permanently blighted? Did the war mark a turning point when they'd realised things about their own capacity for leadership and decision? Did they become more ambitious personally as a result of this? And we've barely touched the surface of this, though I've been personally doing a lot of work on it. What sort of men were in the 46th Division? I came across this recently in a Wolverhampton MA thesis done by a chap called Quintin Watt. And what sort of men were in the 46th Division? Well, Dudley, although in Worcestershire, covered an area, the newspaper covered an area that was South Staffordshire Regiment and therefore 46th North Midland Division. There is an objector at most meetings, and at a recruiting meeting this week, a man in the audience asked, why didn't the rich men's sons go? Why was it the sons of the poor who had to defend their country? Blah, blah. And then what follows is a rejection of it. And the man who wrote the rejection was a wise man, because one thing about Britain in the First World War is that whatever you think of the upper classes, and I have my own opinions on them, they led from the front in the First World War. They didn't send it's not like Vietnam. You know, you want to embarrass a Harvard man, ask him how many Harvard men were killed in Vietnam. Now we're thinking about army officers, territorial army officers. This is a classic from the writer Dennis Wheatley. 3 types, hearty hunting, shooting and fishing types from the country units, popular but brainless. Rare men of real ability in country and city units. The great majority in city units who held inferior positions in civil life and had become territorial officers as one of the few means open to them of ordering people about. One thinks of Captain Mannering immediately, though he was, of course, a patriot. Because officers, this is obviously a stereotype, but there's an element of truth in it. And one of the things that the regulars had with the territorials is for this reason, because there were people like this, the territorials were too chummy. They did not impose regular army standards of discipline, things like saluting, cleanliness, that kind of thing. So I did this table ages ago. Discipline and courage. 46th North Midland Division executed only 1 man under the Army Act. 1. They won 6 Victoria Crosses. And you look down that list and you think, so So the most is the 42nd Division, which had a rather troubled time in Gallipoli, but nobody else more than 4. And the 52nd Lowland Division doesn't execute anyone. Now, if you took a regular division, and the division which executes most men under the Army Act was the 3rd Division, the regulars imposed higher standards and expected them to be met. And they were concerned that this was not the case in the territorial formations because of the nature of the kind of people who became territorial officers. So I thought I'd have a look at the territorial officers. I had a look at the battalion commanders in 1915. 46th North Midland Division was the first territorial division to go to war as a complete formation in March 1915, and apart from a sort of slight detour to Egypt, which wasn't the whole of the division, in 1916 it spent the whole of the war on the Western Front. Now these are the sort of people, now look at their ages. Memorize their ages, because we're going to find some chaps later on in this talk who are considerably younger. And look at their background: schoolmaster, solicitor, businessman and politician, 2 GPs, seed grower and merchant, another 2 solicitors, architect and a mining engineer. These are not the normal backgrounds of regular army officers, whose backgrounds are dominated, first of all, by being the sons of previous army officers and the sons of clergymen. Those are 2 of the major sort of family backgrounds of pre-First World War British Army officers. This lot come from a completely different commercial and professional background. It's always struck me how many civilians, when the war broke out, who did well during the war, either as battalion commanders or occasionally as brigade commanders, were solicitors and occasionally accountants. There's one distinguished Australian brigade commander who has a huge entry in Who Was Who, never mentions his service in the First World War, but talks about all the honours he won as an actuary. Well, it takes all sorts, doesn't it? So the next time you go and visit your solicitor, it'll probably be a lady anyway these days, just think that under the suit, there beats the heart of a warrior. The other group that do amazingly well are architects. I think at least 1, possibly 2 of the Australian divisional commanders were architects. So within the soul of architects, who after all design and build things, is this profound desire to smash things up as well. I think it's deeply Freudian. I should do a paper on this one day. So Goodman, who's on there somewhere, Lieutenant Colonel G.D. Goodman, solicitor, he actually makes it to brigade command. And by the end of the war, there are only 11 territorial force generals in the BEF, only 11. And one of those is the Commander Royal Artillery of the 46th North Midland Division, Sir Hill Child, ex-regular, but left the army sometime after the South African War, became a territorial, and after the war was a rather distinguished member of the royal household. But one of the big complaints the territorials had is they didn't get a fair crack of the whip when it came to general officer appointments. And that's apparent. I mean, I think there are more civilians who became brigadier generals who didn't go down the TF route, who were temporary gentlemen, who were Kitchener appointees rather than territorials. It stands out a mile. Now, this was the first commanding officer when the war broke out of the 1st 6th North Staffordshire Regiment based in Burton-on-Trent. As you see, Colonel John Gretton. Read it for yourselves. Gretton was an archetype of the reactionary Tory brewer, a gloomy, stubborn and suspicious politician and a sharp-eared gossip. There was a Tory MP for, 48 years, apparently never made a speech, and if he did make a speech, nobody could understand it because he mumbled all the time. So this is the classic number one of Dennis Wheatley's 3 types of territorial officer. But he never went to war. I mean, the army noticed, 1, he was too old, and 2, he was no good in a modern war. So he was replaced. But at least he'd been in the territorial force. When he died in 1947, he left £2.3 million. So the rich did not skive off in the First World War, as we will see as I work my way through this talk. Now this is a different kettle of fish. This is Richmond Raynor, who commanded the 1st 5th South Staffords. He stands out on that list of battalion commanders of 1915 because he's the only one with any active combat experience. He fought with the 1st Leicesters in South Africa. He was a grammar school boy, Farnham Grammar School, a graduate in science, again, which is very unusual in those days for anyone to have a university science background in the army. Eventually became a schoolmaster, and from 1912 commanded the OTC at Clifton College, which was Douglas Haig's old school, and many other senior officers of the First World War. He was wounded at Gommecourt on the 1st July 1916, later commanded the 10th Dukes, the 9th Cheshires, and the 5th South Wales Borderers. And if this wasn't enough, in an action-packed life, after the war he took holy orders, became a clergyman of the Church of England and rector of St Giles Church, Sheldon, Birmingham. A remarkable man in every way. Here's another one. This is George Fowler, CO with the 1st 8th Sherwoods, killed on the 15th of October 1915, 2 days after the disastrous attack of the Staffordshire Brigade at the Hohenzollern Redoubt. Rugby and New College, Oxford. Very few pre-war regular officers were graduates. Quite a few had been to university, but most of them didn't take their degrees, including, of course, Douglas Haig. So Rugby and New College, Oxford. Mining engineer. When you think of the great universities at this period, you think of classics. You don't think of them doing mining. After his death, he left £30,000, which was a lot of money in those days. So another rich man from a non-traditional army background with non-traditional army skills joins the territorial force out of a sense of duty and patriotism. Right, these are the platoon commanders of 1915, of the 1st 5th North Staffords. I've used the 1st 5th North Staffords not only because it's from my part of the world, but because my old school chum, Levison Wood, and his wife Janice, I've done a really detailed study of the officers of the 1st 5th North Staffords, of which they've got a huge number of names, and not just the officers, but the other ranks as well. But look at their ages, occupations. Now, Staffordshire was one of the counties that most supported the territorial principle before 1914. In fact, it was the star county when it came to people joining the territorial force. But one thing I noticed is that virtually all these platoon commanders on that list of 1915, when they actually deployed to war, all joined up after the outbreak of war. They're what I call wartime territorials. Now you've got to remember that anyone who joined the territorial force before 1914 thought they were joining it for home defence. And some of them didn't like the idea of going abroad. So there's a falling by the wayside, which I think has quite often not been commented on as much as it might. And so when these people go to war in 1915, these platoon commanders are all people who were commissioned after the 4th of August 1914. Wartime commissions. 10 had spent time in the ranks, 9 of them in the North Staffordshire Regiment. They were all well known in their communities, and there were interconnections at various levels: family, business, and not least, sport. William Aubry Bowers, Winchester and New College, Oxford, son of Eli Bowers, coal owner of Barlaston Hall and Caverswall Castle. He was captain of Caverswall Cricket Club. Man with a strong social conscience. He was involved with Oxford House at Bethnal Green, doing good work amongst the poor of the East End. And he was killed at Gommecourt, not in the attack. He was actually bringing barbed wire up to the front with our friend, Private Tommy Higgins. And he said, "Would you like some help with that, Higgins?" Well, he carrying the barbed wire. This is behind the line. And he got killed by a shell burst. He was also a member of Staffordshire County Council. I think he was 30 nearly when he died, leaving £137,000. So he didn't say, "Oh, it didn't sound frightfully good, this war. I think I'll go away on my super yacht and hide away till it's all over." This was a man, family man, rich man. These were the kind of people who responded to the call. And if you're doubtful, that's where he lived. It's not a modest terraced house. It's not even a modest terraced castle. It's a fully detached castle. Caverswall Castle. That's where he lived. Extraordinary. Okay. Let's look what they're like at the end of the war. These are the battalion commanders in 1918. Again, look at their ages compared with the ages of the battalion commanders in 1915. My good friend and brilliant student, Peter Hodgkinson, who wrote the fine book on British infantry battalion commanders in the First World War, said he thought they were much younger, this lot, much younger, but still on the elderly side, because you get in large numbers of battalion commanders by the end of the war in their 20s. Have we got anyone in his 20s there? But they are much younger. And again, look at the background. Solicitors again. Another solicitor. I want to talk about one of them. This man, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Richard Evans, a North Walian from a modest background. His father was a stone cutter, a graduate of London University. He was a civil servant when the war broke out. He was also fluent in Welsh. Welsh, I think, was probably his first language, and had written plays in Welsh, which had been performed on the stage even in London. And he was a bard of the Eisteddfod. He's a proper Welshman, in other words. And of course, what do proper Welshmen we may know something about in the First World War do? They have mistresses. I'll come to her in a minute. Peter Hodgkinson described Evans as, quote, a jobbing CO. That is, when there was a vacancy, and vacancies kept appearing all the time in 1918, people don't realise the extent, the ferocity, the tempo of the fighting in 1918. Compared with 1916. 1916, people did a stint in the front line, they were rotated within the front line, then they were rotated out, and they'd have a period when they were resting, training, getting clean clothes, and so on. It was kind of ritualised. In 1918, it's much more like the fighting, say, in Normandy, 44 and onwards, where people are being thrown in every 2 or 3 days. It's a different test, and a much greater test on people's courage and upon their ability to command. And a lot of battalion commanders get killed in this period. So somebody gets killed, Evans is the bloke they shove in, And his name is now going to be forever associated with the crossing of the St Quentin Canal. He commanded the 1st 6th North Staffords, who actually crossed the captured Rickerville Bridge. But he only commanded the battalion from the 1st of September 1918, when he took over from his predecessor, Colonel Story, who was a pre-war regular of the North Staffords. He was lieutenant when the war broke out, who'd been wounded on the 1st of September 1918. And Evans took command on the 1st of September 1918 and was killed in action at Gommecourt on the 3rd of October. So that is a very short period of time. But it's during that period when the 1st 6th North Staffords has its greatest achievement of the war. That's his mistress. She's called May Jones, as you might expect for a good Welshman. And he, for some reason, she's known as Oliver. Evans was married, but in 1911, his wife decided to move to Canada. And not only did she move to Canada, but she moved to British Columbia, which is as far away in Canada as you can get from Britain. And the thought was that Evans would eventually join her, but he never did. When the war came, he joined the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, 17th Battalion, and effectively, I've got absolute proof that their relationship was sexual, but it was certainly intense and emotional and important to both of them. Now, when he was killed, he died intestate, didn't leave a will. And of course, as far as the army is concerned, she does not exist. So when she starts making inquiries with the War Office, what's happened to his belongings, where is he buried, and so on, they sort of say, well, excuse me, madam, but who are you? Meanwhile, his wife, from the fastnesses of British Columbia, is insisting on her conjugal rights to know all these things. And his service file is an absolute, you could write a play based on Evans's service file. It's, like they used to say of the News of the World, all human life is there. And you can see these tensions, within his personal and social life. Here's another one. This is Bernard Van, VC. Clergyman, not after the war, but before the war. He tried to become a chaplain. So he turned up and said, please sir, I'd like to become a chaplain. And they say, well, I've got no vacancies at the moment. Tough. So he joined the army as an infantry soldier and was an extremely brave and able battalion commander. I'm sometimes a bit wary of VC winners, particularly battalion commanders. I've recently been reading the diary of Neville Marshall, VC. I don't know whether any of you have heard of him. He was, amongst other things, for one time, Wilfred Owen's commanding officer, the Manchesters. He was killed in the same crossing of St Canal as Wilfred Owen. They're buried in the same cemetery, Orse Communal Cemetery. He is the University of Birmingham's VC winner. It's quite an explosive diary because he's continually complaining about how the officers, and this is of one regular battalion and one Kitchener battalion that he was in, were scruffy, drunken. He was saying that, I can't remember which battalion it was now, that the company mess, not the battalion mess, the company mess, had gone through 36 bottles of whiskey in a week. All right? Now, I will admit this is not my view of British Army officers at the end of the war. But maybe there's some truth in this. But I have difficulty actually believing anything Marshall says, because he was a liar. He lied about all sorts of things during his life and during his military career, and he's always accusing these new officers, these junior officers, of not being gentlemen. Well, in my view, took one to no one, because he wasn't a gentleman either. And I'd like to look at the platoon commanders of 1918. Field Marshal Wavell described the First World War as a platoon commander's war. And this was certainly officially the case from the publication of SS 143 in January 1917, to devolve tactical decision making and initiative down to the platoon level. And to have platoons that did different things. So some would be rifle grenadiers, some would be bombers, some would be Lewis gunners, some would be riflemen. And this helped to restore to the battlefield the concept enshrined in pre-1914 Army regulations of fire and manoeuvre. But it also meant that it required reservoirs of courage, understanding, and initiative at a very low level. Mainly, if not entirely, from people who were not pre-war soldiers. Now, one thing that strikes me about this is how young some of them are, how the fact that many of them are not officers, they run out of officers. In the 1st 6th North Staffords, only 11 out of the 16 platoons had officers. The others were commanded by sergeants. A lot of the officers had come up through the ranks. 7 platoons commanded by NCOs. 3 were originals: Percy Bowler, quarryman and general labourer, Joseph Fowkes and Bert Meade. So they'd been in right from the start. There is a view of the British Army that it was historically over-officered. And you got officers in the British Army, doing things that no one would ever have done in the German Army. It's always struck me that, the death of Vera Britton's fiancé, Roland Leighton, mending barbed wire in no man's land. Well, you'd never find a German army officer mending barbed wire in no man's land. That's not a job for an officer. And people continually say in both world wars that the degree of initiative and tactical understanding by German NCOs was at a higher level than British NCOs. I think that's overdrawn, that comparison, certainly by the end of the war, where it is clear that you've got a tranche of NCOs in quite responsible positions as platoon commanders who were hard-bitten warriors who'd come up the hard way. and were there because they knew how to do it, and they could get other men to do it. That's the important thing. I'd like to draw your attention to Frank Hartshorn, platoon commander of the 1st 5th Sherwoods. I started this survey of the sociology of the Officer Corps of the 46th North Midland Division with William Aubry Bowers. By modern standards, a millionaire, son of a coal owner. Well, there you have Frank Hartshorn, platoon commander, son of a coal miner. And that's indicative of the change in the sociology of the British Army's Officer Corps. That you got platoon commanders, he was a commissioned officer, second lieutenant, who was the son of a coal miner. This is virtually unimaginable in 1914. One of the other platoon commanders is this man, looks about 12 at the time. This is John Cridland Barrett, VC, platoon commander of the 1st 5th Leicesters. He was a medical student when the war broke out, later a surgeon at the Leicester Royal Infirmary, born in Leamington Spa, son of a pharmaceutical chemist. Again, non-traditional background for a pre-war army officer. I happened to mention to my old tutor, Jack Simmons, after whom the library in the National Railway Museum is named, of Barrett. And he said, "Oh, he lives round the corner from you." I said, "Really?" "Yes." So Jack gave me an introduction to him, and he literally did. He lived about 200 yards from where I did. I must say he lived in a much nicer house than the one I was in. But this would be, I don't know, a couple of years before he died, and had a chat to him. And he's the only, I think he's the only VC winner of the First World War I've ever met. But gave you that, when I shook hands with him, I thought, I'm shaking hands with the 46th North Midland Division here. And it's, you know, the contact is handed on. But I'd like to end on this chap. This is Newman Smith, sergeant, aged 20, platoon commander in the 1st 5th Lincolns, even though he's not from Lincolnshire. He was a son of a Sunderland, Slater and Tyler. Now, to become a platoon commander from that sort of background, at the age of 20, he must have been a remarkable bloke. And it's people like him, I think, have been almost entirely forgotten and airbrushed out of the history of the First World War. One of the things which comes over strongly in another of Peter Hodgkinson's books is that the British Army, for all its losses, for all its suffering, for all the difficulty it went through in 1918, the individual soldiers, and certainly their commanders at this level, at the platoon level, had not lost what Peter calls the will to combat. They were prepared and willing to take the battle to the enemy. They were not skulking in trenches, waiting for the war to come to a conclusion. This is a view I used to get from my students all the time, undergraduate students at Birmingham, because even the dullest student, and most of my students at Birmingham were not dull, knew that the war ended on the 11th of November 1918. So they presumed everybody knew it was going to end on the 11th of November 1918 and was just sitting there saying, well, yeah, another 2 weeks, Bert, you know, we'll be all right, we'll sit here, you know, finish in a couple of weeks. That was not apparent at all at the time. And they were not waiting for it to end. They were fighting to bring it to an end and to bring it to a successful conclusion. Because no matter to what extent the morale of the British Army slumped, and it did slump a couple of times badly during the war, people were not prepared to substitute peace at the price of defeat. They wanted peace, but they wanted to win the war. And they showed the determination, the willingness, the fighting skill to win the war. And it's delivered by totally forgotten chaps like Sergeant Newman Smith, aged 20, killed at Frenois in October 1918. Thank you.